So today we're going to start another chapter of ours. This is our second chapter called biological molecules. Okay, Jay. Now, when we talk about biological molecules, obviously we humans we have many different molecules, many different elements which are making up our biological and our metabolical framework, which means that we have different atoms, elements combining together to form compounds which are necessary for sustaining our life and which play a vital role in our growth, development, and day to day life processes. Now, the four most common elements in living organisms are basically carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And why is that so? Because when we will be studying the biological molecules which make up our body or which are present in our body, those are actually made up of elements. And the most predominant elements in all these biological molecules are what? Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. ऐसा नहीं है कि इनके अलावा कोई elements present नहीं है. We do take minerals, and in those minerals we take like iron, zinc, magnesium, all of these elements. Those are basically micronutrients. And what do I mean by micronutrients? Micronutrients are those nutrients which aren't needed in large amounts. They're required in very small amounts, and they do not make up the majority part of our body or our metabolic system. Now, the main biological molecules which are present in our body are what? They're carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, nucleic acids, and water. And now, when we're talking about these biological molecules, and all of these are very important. And why are they important? Because these three molecules, these three are carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids. These are macronutrients. We need them in our nutrition. We need them in our diet. Why? Because carbohydrates are a direct source of energy for us. We break down carbohydrates into the most simple form of sugar, which is glucose, and then that glucose is oxidized to produce energy in the form of ATP. And then that ATP is basically the energy currency of our cells, of our body, and that is utilized in all the energy consuming processes, all the vital life processes. When you talk about proteins, proteins are very important, are very important building blocks of our metabolic system again. Lipids again are a source of energy for us. Proteins हमें basically चाहिए होता है for our growth and development. So these are our macronutrients. Nucleic acids, where do we find our nucleic acids? Basically RNA and DNA. These are the two nucleic acids which are present in our body, and obviously, we all know the importance of these two. DNA is basically where all the hereditary information, where all the genetic information of a human being or for any organism is stored. And DNA is basically like an identity for every cell, for every organism, like how we have an identity card for our colleges, for our institution. That tells us that we are a student and what course we're doing, what class do we come from, basic information of your guardian, your parents. So all the necessary information of a person's identity are present in the identity card. Same way, DNA has all the genetic information of an organism, and it's very important. And why is it important? Because obviously DNA and RNA are involved in what? They're involved in protein synthesis. They're involved in the formation of protein-based hormones. They're involved in the synthesis of protein enzymes. We know that enzymes are made up of proteins, and enzymes are basically very important again for our metabolic activities. And we will study more about enzymes in our next chapter. So that's about nucleic acid and water. We know that majority, like 90% of our blood plasma is basically what? It's water. So water is a very important component of our blood, which is basically present everywhere in our body. And water is a very important component of our cells. And cells are the basic structural and functional unit of life. So the cytoplasm has a lot of fluid content, has a lot of water content. So water is a very, very important biological molecule, and it is said that 65 to 70% of our body is made up of water. So in this particular chapter, which is biological molecules, we will be studying about carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and water. And as far as nucleic acids are concerned, we're going to study nucleic acids in chapter number 6, which is protein synthesis and DNA. Now, before we dive into these biological molecules, let's understand a few terms. And those terms are macromolecule, polymer, and monomer. Now, as the name suggests, macromolecule. Now, there are two words, micro, and the opposite is macro. Now, micro means small, and macro means large. So when you say macromolecule, I'm talking about a large molecule, a giant molecule. And obviously, if there is a large molecule, that molecule can be broken down into smaller and simpler molecules. So a macromolecule is a giant or a large molecule made up of simpler molecules. Now, when we talk about polymer, now poly basically means many. So polymer is a large molecule that is made up of small repeating units called monomers. Now, where is this word poly coming from? Poly, we have understood it literally means what? Many. Now, polymer basically means made up of many small subunits. So polymer basically has a lot of many small monomers. So it is actually something like this. I have a monomer. This is my monomer. And these monomers are connecting together. And these monomers should be same repeating unit. So something which is made up of many small repeating units, that macromolecule is called a polymer. That large molecule is called a polymer. So basically, polymer is anything which is made up of many smaller subunits which are repeating in a pattern. Now, let me draw something else. Now tell me, is this a polymer or is it not a polymer? What do you guys think? Is it a polymer or is it not a polymer? Correct. So this is not a polymer. And why is this not a polymer? Because there are no repeating units. Is it a macromolecule? Yes, it is a macromolecule. Why? Because it is a large molecule made up of simpler molecules. ये सारे जो हैं, ये बहुत सारे simpler molecules, they have joined together, they have bonded together to form a larger molecule. But because there are no repeating units, there is no repeating pattern, we would not call it a polymer. Why? Because polymer, by definition, is basically a combination, an amalgamation. Aren't the circles repeating? Okay. So basically, the circles are repeating, but is it only made up of circles? Now, let me explain. This is a smaller unit A. This is B. This is C. This is A. This is A. This is A, and then this is B. Now, if I ask you what is the pattern for this molecule, you would say that the pattern is basically A, B, C, A, and B. Now, is it a repeating pattern? It is not a repeating pattern. Now, let me draw something for your clarity. Now, tell me, the figure that I have drawn for you, is it a polymer or is it not a polymer? Tell me, what do you guys think? And then Muskan, I'll just answer your question through this. But suggest me, do you think it's a polymer or is it not a polymer? Hajra, what do you think? Okay, so Muskan is saying this is not a polymer. Okay, let's write the pattern for this. This is basically A, B, C. This is A, this is B, this is C, this is A, this is B, and this is C. Now, if I ask you, or if you could suggest me, Now, can I say, yes, Hajra, you're correct. Now, look at this. Now, this is one repeat unit, this is one repeat unit, and this is one repeat unit. So basically, Muskan, what we mean by a repeating unit is that there is a segment or there is one molecule which is repeating in a pattern. It is possible that एक molecule, for example, your question might be arising from this part, that this region is basically repeating in itself, right? But the problem over here is कि जो ये repeat कर रहा है, there is not a repeating pattern. There is not a repeating subunit being formed, right? If I write the pattern for this molecule, it is basically okay. So it is basically ABC, 5 A's, and then a B. So you cannot identify a repeating pattern over here. I cannot ask you, show me the units of this polymer. You can say, okay, I can identify the individual units, but I cannot identify a repeating unit. So a macromolecule is made up of smaller units. मैं इसको separate, for example, if I break down this molecule, if I break down this macromolecule, for example, like this. If I break it from here, मैंने इसको split कर दिया in these two parts, right? So, do you see a repeating pattern? Can I say that this part 1 of this molecule, this section and this section, are they same? Are they repeating? No, they're different. But if I split this molecule like this, there is a repeating pattern. So if you observe something, a large molecule made up of small repeating units called monomers, then that species is a polymer. That large molecule is a polymer when it is made up of small repeating units called monomers. But if there is a large molecule like this, and you cannot identify small repeating units, you will call it a macromolecule. Why? Because it is a large molecule made up of simpler molecules, simpler units. But because you do not observe a repeating pattern, it would just be a macromolecule and not a polymer. Is this difference between a polymer and a macromolecule clear to all of you? Perfect. Now, हमने जो ये सब समझा, now there is a statement, there is a conclusion that we draw from all of this. And what is that conclusion? That conclusion basically is that all polymers are macromolecules. Why? Because all the polymers are made up of monomers. And what are monomers? Monomers are small repeating units joining together to form a large molecule. So a polymer is a large molecule, correct? So it would be identified as a macromolecule. But not all macromolecules are polymers. And what do we mean by that? We mean that we have a macromolecule. It is a large molecule. It is made up of small, simpler units, small, simpler molecules. But because there is no repeating unit of these small, simpler molecules, there is no repeating pattern which we can identify, we will not call them a polymer. Why? Because in this macromolecule, in this particular macromolecule, we are unable to identify a repeating pattern or repeating subunits or monomers. Is this statement, is this definition, is this difference between a macromolecule and a polymer clear? Very good. Now, moving on, why did I explain all of this to you? Because when we talk about these 5 and specifically, क्योंकि water तो हमारे पास macromolecule नहीं है ना, water तो बहुत simple सा H2O है हमारे पास. These 4 are basically our macromolecules. The first 4 species that I've written over here, all these 4 are macromolecules. ठीक है? All 4 of them are giant molecules or large molecules made up of smaller, simpler units, simpler atoms, and simpler molecules. But 3 of these 4 are polymers, and one of them is a macromolecule. मतलब macromolecule चारों हैं, लेकिन हमने क्या कहा that all polymers are macromolecules. but not all macromolecules are polymers. So these four species, they are all macromolecules, but lipids is not a lipids are not a polymer. They're only मैक्रोमोलिक्यूल. और जब हम लिपिड्स का चैप्टर पढ़ लेंगे या हम ये चारों biological molecules को understand कर लेंगे, it is then when I'll come back to this statement to explain you guys why carbohydrates, why proteins, why nucleic acids are polymers, and why lipids are not polymers and they're just simply macromolecules. Okay, is it clear so far?